Hello and welcome to the first episode of Unending History. My name is Max, and this is a show that I and some friends of mine are creating to try and alleviate a few problems in the current media landscape. These problems being that many important international issues are often overlooked, as well as poorly discussed. Too often, you get the same 10 minutes of shallow information, or you get a sort of two-sides debate which doesn't help illuminate the issues for the public, but rather obscures them by presenting things as if there are only two ways of looking at it. Not only that, but often those two points of view are presented as being inherently opposed to each other, when they often agree on many points. As the old saying goes, two heads are better than one. What that phrase misses is that it matters how those heads are used. We feel that open discussion, as opposed to artificially constructed debate, is a more useful way to explore these complex topics, because rather than cementing positions as being opposed to each other, it encourages exploration of new perspectives and ideas, as well as allowing people to evolve those ideas. We hope to develop a method for discussion that will encourage people not just to think for themselves, but to think in collaboration with others. This is an introduction to the show recorded near the end of the series. The general subject of the series is Afghanistan during the Western invasion and intervention that took place there from 2001 to 2021. This is a 6-part series recording over 10 months. First, we research a topic, share that research with each other, and then come together to discuss what we have found and hear what everyone is thinking. That discussion is what the content of each episode is made of. As each episode goes by, our knowledge and our thinking evolve. As we created these episodes, we also evolved our style, and I hope that the listener will not only think about the content of the discussion, but the form in which that discussion is had. As I said earlier, this show as a whole is about developing methods of collaborative thinking. That means finding the best way for those participating in a discussion to grow their understanding of both a specific topic and the general subject. So, hopefully without having over-explained, I present the first discussion of the series. Hi, I'm Max. Today, we're starting with a series on Afghanistan and the state-building project undertaken by Western powers there, which ended mostly in failure in September of 2021. This episode in specific will be on infrastructure projects. But before we go any farther, I'm just going to introduce myself and say hello. Again, I'm Max. I'm going to be running the episode for the most part here, and I'm joined today by Owen and Armand, two friends of mine who are going to be helping and aiding the discussion. If you guys want to say hello.
Hey, I'm Armand.
Hello, I'm Owen.
Guys, we have been looking into the various extensive efforts that went on in Afghanistan in regards to what was literally being built. There was a lot of larger sort of political structures that were also built up by the West, which also failed, but there was a lot of infrastructure building, of roads, of dams, of hospitals that went on, and you didn't tend to hear too much about that in the news. And when you did hear about it, it was usually pretty bad. And there's a reason for that. It's because overall those efforts didn't go very well. There's a large number of problems that were faced that we've talked about in the past, from corruption to literal lack of supplies, and then of course the violence that is simply endemic within the region. With all those issues combined, and it really meant that billions of dollars ended up being spent, and a lot of that ended up either half working or not building anything at all. In order to elucidate on this issue, we're going to start with a particularly famous, I should say, example of the Kajaki Dam. The Kajaki Dam is in a region which was mostly controlled by the Taliban starting from about 2011 onwards, and it was a dam originally built in the 1950s, in part by U.S. funding, but has been destroyed a series of times, both in the Soviet invasion and in the American invasion, and was subsequently rebuilt and expanded upon by the United States. It is a working dam. It is in some sense, a success in that the dam at least was. It's not really clear how well it's working now, but it was powering a large region in Afghanistan. However, the upkeep costs and the the expertise needed were not really present within the country of Afghanistan itself. It relied heavily on foreign funding and foreign expertise. Before the Taliban took full control of the Afghan government in September of 2021, it was being worked on by a Turkish construction company, Construction 77, or 77 Construction, depending on how you rate it. And they have, as far as I can tell, have completely pulled out of those efforts. There's no more funding for that effort as well, and it's likely that even if the dams, can still run for a few months, it's going to fall into disrepair. Also, one interesting thing to think about is what that Turkish company was doing was the exact same thing the American companies that had been hired, well, I should say international companies, really, of Black & Veatch, which had been hired to work on it back in 2012, were literally supposed to do the same thing, which is build a third turbine and expand its grid, and they basically failed to do that. And this is a colossal failure. This is a failure of the magnitude of $300 million and was considered a failure back in 2016, and not much success was really had, basically since it was rebuilt in 2010. As I said before, this is a region that was controlled by the Taliban, which meant that a large portion of the money that was being spent to work on the dam ends up being paid to the Taliban as a sort of payoff or a bribe to not let them in. And Armand, as you've noted to me before, this is a pretty common thing in Afghanistan, that you basically are just going to pay people off, right?
Yeah, that's pretty common. Basically, often the cost of bribery or bribing the Taliban is much lower than the cost of hiring security, something that is not even dependable on in the first place. And not only is it more cost effective to bribe the Taliban, you can be guaranteed you won't have attacks
right
to begin with.
And the Taliban, Construction 77 reported that the Taliban kind of liked them, because another thing that was going on under Construction 77's efforts was that there were guards, and the Taliban would fight the guards, but wouldn't attack the actual construction workers, because, of course, the construction workers were generating electricity, which the Taliban then taxed the local populace for, despite the fact that they weren't the ones funding it. And the Taliban always wanted to function as a government, right? And, of course, now they have much larger responsibilities, which we don't know how well they're going to do with. But the Khajaki Dam is, in some respects, a sort of symbol for a lot of the construction efforts that were going on. Things were supposed to get built, they don't get built, money ends up in the hands of either the democratic government that was in Kabul or in the hands of the Taliban. Funds are misspent, people go to sites, they find that the clinic, which has been funded with $5 million of US aid money, has nothing but some pipes in the ground, and it's been 5 years. Corruption is a complicated issue within a country like Afghanistan because it's so endemic. Basically, wherever you go, whether it's the judicial system or a government agency or the police, you're going to face corruption. You're going to be asked to give a bribe. It's extremely common, and part of the cause of that, both in Afghanistan and elsewhere in the world, is that the funding from the government is so unreliable. People aren't paid consistently, or they aren't paid enough, and they often try to make up for that with bribes. That isn't to say that they aren't bribes, and there's many people who are paid enough and are still going to take bribes. It's a pretty major part of the cultural way of dealing with problems there. And payment for helping out, right, and dealing with the issue that I'm facing, right, say somebody's stolen stuff from my house, so I go to the police. If they're going to help me out, they might expect payment, or the prosecutor will expect payment, and the judges might expect payment for a favorable outcome. It goes pretty deep through the system. And a lot of people might not be happy with that system, but they also understand that, in a sense, that's just kind of the way it is. With corruption that endemic, it's interesting to look at national efforts. And one of those major national efforts was the Ring Road, right? in the news back in the day, you'd hear a lot about the Ring Road, right? The U.S. is going to build more highways and build a giant road to connect all the country, to connect all the big cities. And that Ring Road, again, was a bit of a mixed success. There were large chunks of it built, but it wasn't completely built, right?
Yeah, the Ring Road has been very crucial for maintaining order for any central government in Afghanistan since the 1960s, when the Soviets began the project. One of the guiding authorities on Afghan history and politics, as I've done research for this subject, for me, has been an anthropologist named Thomas Barfield. And he pointed out something very important about why infrastructure is so important for maintaining order in Afghanistan, which is it's the one big way that you can exert power as a central government in Afghanistan. As a reminder, Afghanistan is a very mountainous place, especially in the center, which means that if you want to be able to exert lots of central control, you need help from roads. As Owen will elaborate on later, railroads are another option, but have their own litany of problems in Afghanistan. And the good thing about roads is they're a little easier to maintain. They're more accessible. Other Afghans can use them. They're not just for government troops. And one of the reasons that arguably that the Afghan state collapsed and was overrun by the Taliban was the mismanagement of the Ring Road reconstruction.
Mm-hmm. Which was funded, again, by the United States, right?
Funded by the United States, yes. Right. So why did that happen? Well, a number of reasons. One part of it is corruption, and another part of it is waste and mismanagement. So as Max alluded to or spoke of, the Taliban played a huge role in disrupting the construction and reconstruction of the Ring Road. It was very typical for the Taliban to extort construction crews directly or to fire upon them.
Right.
And while it is the case that they would often avoid inflicting large amounts of damage, they nonetheless killed dozens of construction workers and guards. And some stretches of the Ring Road were so expensive that they cost something in the neighborhood of $5 million for every mile.
Right.
Between Khost and Paktia, apologies if I'm pronouncing those incorrectly. It was $5 million per mile to construct those roads.
And one of the costs that it's the same with the Khashoggi Dam. It was in an area not that far from Kandahar, but it was relatively rural. And in that area as well of the Ring Road, it's relatively rural. And one thing about the rural areas is they were disproportionately influenced by the Taliban.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And so with something like the Ring Road and with electricity infrastructure, that's going to be a lot stronger in urban areas like Kandahar or in Kabul, where the Taliban aren't as likely to start blowing things up or shooting the construction workers. And that rural-urban divide is something that is very present in infrastructure and very present throughout many of the issues plaguing Afghanistan.
Absolutely, and throughout the U.S.'s involvement with Afghanistan and nation building, their priority was always in the cities.
Right.
They always gave more attention to the cities, and interactions with the more rural areas were always more tenuous. They were less cemented
and frequently violent compared
and
to
frequently violent. Yes, the urban Afghans' perception of the United States was radically different from the rural Afghans' perception of the United States. Rural Afghans usually interacted with Americans in the context of raids and
drone strikes.
Yeah, or drone strikes.
Yeah,
which, the psychological toll of that was enormous for a lot of people because, first of all, you can't know if it's going to be you. It doesn't matter if you're involved with the Taliban.
Right.
And secondly, never see if you're in danger. So it's always safe to assume that you are in danger.
Right. This isn't to say that there wasn't any fighting within the cities and so on. There certainly was,
No.
and and lots of people did die in the cities. But the difference that needs to be illuminated here is just how barren the funding was for rural areas, or at least the implementation of said funding, right? We're going to build up the dam, or we're going to build the ring road, or we're going to build hospitals in this area, and, people will like us, right? Because we're going to help them out. That was the whole idea, right? That was General Petraeus's idea of getting the lights back on, right? Getting the lights working. And generally that attitude meant spending a lot of money without seeing a lot of results, especially outside the cities.
Yeah, and make no mistake, to a limited extent, it started to work in the first years of America's time in Afghanistan. In 2003, the ring road was being used to move medical supplies and security forces into key areas.
One thing to remember there, not to cut you off, but one thing to remember there is in 2003, 2004, up until about 2006, the Taliban had really been shattered. They were much, much weaker, and they spent those years rebuilding their forces. And so as their strength built, less progress was made, again, especially in rural areas.
Oh, yeah. And another key factor is the war in Iraq diverted a lot of focus away from Afghanistan, and it drained resources that could have gone to Afghanistan, and it results in the U.S. turning a blind eye to lots of Taliban activity.
And part of that problem of the moving of focus, the shifting of focus, is in part, there was still a lot of funding for Afghanistan, but because the Bush administration went in with so little planning, and so many experts at the time who were working with the administration were criticizing it, while working with it, for saying they don't have a plan, right? They brought us in, they're asking us questions, but they're already in Afghanistan. They should have asked these questions before they went in. They needed to make a plan to understand what the Afghans need and how the Afghan culture is and so on before they go in, so that they can have a plan. But the Bush administration really was not intending in the initial few months to do any state building. They thought that they could just go in, break up the Taliban, and leave, but they realized immediately, basically, that that was a mistake, and started throwing in funding, but there was never a very unified plan. And using again, we're focusing on infrastructure here, USAID and the Department of Defense often weren't very well coordinated with each other on their efforts. There was no real agency or apparatus, and there still isn't, within the United States for doing something like a state building project. The State Department doesn't have the manpower, the DoD has the manpower and the organizational structure, but doesn't have the purpose, in a sense, and doesn't have the philosophy of doing state building very well cemented within its ethos. They're really a kind of, build something up and leave kind of organization. They are a military organization, which means they're also not, their attitude towards working with foreign civilian governments is often not very nuanced, and this only exacerbates all the problems that already existed there. Part of that lack of planning is also present in the complete lack of railroad infrastructure, right? There are very, very few railroads, and many of them are quite old.
Yes, that is definitely the case. I mean, the railway infrastructure of Afghanistan is almost non-existent. So Afghanistan historically, of course, or if today, is not in any way a wealthy nation, and railways can be expensive to build. Most of Afghanistan, up to about the time of the US invasion in 2001, probably only had about 100 kilometers of actual functioning railway in the country.
Right.
And these were all Soviet-era railways built to support the communist government of Afghanistan. They all connect to like Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, which at the time would have been in the Soviet Union.
Right.
And I think for the most part were really used to help move Soviet military equipment, because not to go into military stuff, but of course the Soviets relied heavily on trains for their logistical movements.
And one interesting thing to note there is, again, a lot of this That means a lot of the rail infrastructure is in the north, and the Taliban are generally considered to have their biggest strongholds in the south. Right?
Yes,
so again, there's that
in
neglect.
places like the Helmand and Kandahar provinces, whereas all of this, near Turkmenistan and stuff is, well, for one, primarily not ethnically Pashtun
Right.
and not particular strongholds of the Taliban. The Northern Alliance is from this area and stuff like that.
For reference, the Pashtun are the largest ethnic group within Afghanistan. They are not a massive majority or anything like that, but they are the largest, and they are also an ethnic group that is split by the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. There are many Pashtuns on the Pakistan side of the border, which is why that border is one of the most porous borders in the world.
Yes. The post 2001, you have your new Afghan government. There's not really initially any planning for rail infrastructure. The focus is very much on the ring road concept because it's cheaper. It's more, well, not necessarily cheaper, but it's more flexible. Sort of,
Right.
It can be used for many things. Whereas railway, not necessarily that useful. The Afghan government does eventually start to support some small rail projects to improve links between Afghanistan and its neighbours. These are largely done without US support. The US isn't really that interested in rail infrastructure.
Which again, the US's support, is the economic backbone of the democratic government in Afghanistan. So without US support is a major deal.
Really, the only notable finished rail infrastructure that the Afghan government engaged in was sort of a new railway connecting the country to a more modern one connecting them to Turkmenistan. And the biggest one, and the most important one, was building a railway from Herat, which is the second largest city in Afghanistan, into Iran. Over 200 kilometers of railway, so not small really by most metrics, only finished in 2020 as an opened for use in 2020. Now, should use this to add, all of the railway in Afghanistan is freight. There are no passenger trains in Afghanistan. It's only for freight. And this allowed them to, export and import stuff through Iran. And importantly, there was, through Iran's rail network, there was a connection to a port, which is something, of course, Afghanistan doesn't have.
Yes.
But in addition to these projects, as I say, these projects were only finished in 2020. The upgraded railway to Turkmenistan was finished in 2021. Railways take a long time to build, but there are a lot of...
and it's another example of the sort of partial success, right? Something gets built.
Yes.
It's not like the money is completely disappearing. The Kajaki Dam did produce electricity, if on a scale which, by an international comparison, is not particularly large, and the ring road. Large sections of it were built. There was enough resistance from the Taliban, right? And probably one of the reasons, to be fair, maybe a bit to the Afghan government there, one of the reasons they probably didn't build as much rail in the south and didn't focus on, building more from Kandahar, for example, is because they probably didn't believe that it would work, right?
Yes.
That the Taliban would just blow it up or would prevent the construction or get and extort them for more money. So that sort of local focus that the Afghan government could bring to it meant they might have been a little bit more effective per dollar, but even that's a little suspect.
A lot of Afghanistan's exporting industry, as in mining, is in the north, not really in the south, which is what the freight trains would have primarily been used for. And there are a lot of planned railways to be built in Afghanistan that were in and by unfinished, planned, I mean, some of these are from someone had suggested it and they'd been yeah, we'll do that.
Yeah.
And that was it. Some of them, they'd sent out survey teams to check the suitability. In some cases, they'd started laying railway. The big one that they were planning on was to build on the one connecting Herat to Iran, was to build one from Herat to Kabul.
Right.
Which would have been very ambitious, very expensive, but it would have allowed for sort of the movement of goods by rail from one part of the country to another, because none of these small border crossing railways really facilitate, say, if I'm in Kabul and I want to export these, I don't know, silks or something to Iran, I have to drive it to Herat and then put it on a train.
Right. And rail is
thing,
generally a pretty cheap way to move goods.
Yes, yes.
It's usually cheaper than driving,
especially
at scale.
Yeah, and the same thing works for importing. The major port that imports come into to Afghanistan from is Karachi in Pakistan.
Right.
But of course, there's no railway connecting Karachi to anywhere in Afghanistan.
Right.
So what they would do is they would get the nearest railway to the border and unload it onto trucks there and drive to Afghanistan, which is not probably the ideal way you want to be moving goods around. And that is another area. There was a planned railway from Kandahar into Pakistan. I don't think straight to Karachi, but it would have connected through Pakistan's network to Karachi. There would have been, new railways, and then a railway from Kabul into Peshawar in Pakistan to connect that to the railway network as well. But none of these really went beyond the planning stage.
Yeah.
There wasn't probably much money, not many, other than some of their neighbours. So like the upgrade to the railway, and there was a unfinished railway to connect them to Tajikistan, which actually was in large part paid for by the government of Tajikistan. As I'm aware, the Tajikistan side of that railway was finished, and the Afghan one wasn't.
Right. Yeah. Well, they made the same mistake in investment that the US made.
But there's just this lack of investment. China in the early 2010s considered investment as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, but I think ultimately decided that it wasn't really a very effective investment, and it's easier to just go around Afghanistan.
Right. One thing that occurs to me, with the weakness of both the road and rail infrastructure is how divided, both geographically and politically, Afghanistan is. That without, genuine political unity, it's very hard to build a real unifying infrastructure. Those divisions, with all looking at the rail, right, it all leads out of the country. Right.
Another point I'd make on it is also they all used separate rail gauges.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So even if they had been connected, there didn't even seem to be much planning of, well, then the trains we have to move everything onto a different train that's the right gauge, or do we upgrade all of the gauges, make them the same gauge? But the problem is, from building it all to connect to different countries, there are 3 different neighbors of Iran, Pakistan, and the former Soviet Union all use different rail gauges anyway.
Right. And all that, in a sense, leads to areas, on the Iranian border, on the Pakistan border, in some ways being more economically tied, to the extent that it is, to those countries, right? Like, Kabul is just a sort of remote political seat, right, for much of southern Afghanistan. And much of, for much of Afghanistan as a whole. It's a fairly large country. I mean, it's not on the scale of the United States or Russia or something, but it's a pretty big country population-wise. It's fairly large, but there's very little uniting the country. Afghan as an identity is a pretty general name for really a bunch of different groups of people within a political border.
Yeah, that's a really key point, actually, and that's something that we will definitely have to address in a later episode.
Yeah.
Because one question you might ask when you learn about Afghanistan's highly fractured ethnic makeup is, well, why didn't it become like Yugoslavia?
Yeah.
Why didn't it break up? And that has to do, though this is not something to be belabored now, that has to do with the fact that all of these ethnic groups have historically found it useful to have the protection and aid of a unitary state.
Yeah.
Whereas that was not always the case in Yugoslavia.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think one thing I'd like to say here, more generally for this series, is we want to try to paint a picture of just how much of a debacle the infrastructure projects were, right? How much money, we're talking literal billions of dollars that the United States spent on building things in Afghanistan. And, building an infrastructure...
More than they used to rebuild Europe.
Right.
After World War II.
Right. Yeah. It is bigger than the Marshall Plan. I believe it's bigger than the money spent on Europe and Japan together.
Yeah.
Those were pretty big successes. So, the United States came in with the wrong attitude, came in with way too much money. And too much money is a real factor and something that when we talk about corruption, we're going to go into. And not really a lot of concern for what was going on the ground. And as soon as resistance was met, resistance coming in the form of the Taliban, that corruption really took hold and crippled any infrastructure efforts. And if you can't build a road, can you really build a government, right? And
especially in Afghanistan.
Yeah, and that's the picture we're trying to paint here is, we're dealing with a countryside where there is no hospital, at all, right? Like, there's no doctor, right? There's not a doctor's office. There might be some electricity in some regions and no electricity in others.
Well, as the wise George Bush once said, where the road ends, the Taliban begins.
Yeah, and that seems to be a pretty true statement.
A surprisingly true statement from the lips of such a character.
Most of Afghanistan is where the road ends. It's past the road. And if you are in Kabul or a couple other cities, a lot of that infrastructure aid became pretty meaningless, whether from a lack of manpower or a lack of local expertise or corruption or violence, of course. And the lack of medical infrastructure, the lack of electrical infrastructure, and roads and railways, right, of transport infrastructure, means that any state-building project that was being undertaken on the political sphere was really pretty crippled from the start.
Yeah, absolutely. And
I'd agree with that.
And I think that in Afghanistan it's especially important because it's not only how you get services to the Afghan people, like medical aid, like consumer goods, etc., but it's how the government, in theory, can maintain order,
right,
can maintain justice, can counter things like banditry,
right,
crime, etc.
And to take the Kajaki Dam, for example, there was a sort of 5-kilometer perimeter around the Kajaki Dam, which was under some control, and outside that, there was nothing. I mean, the government, the Kabul government, had no control outside of that, which meant, there was money being spent to sort of maintain the Kajaki Dam without any oversight as to what maintaining that dam really was doing, and whether that energy was really being used by people in villages or if it was being used by the Taliban, right? And of course, again, I've already mentioned the Taliban were taxing, I sort of can't get over that they were taxing people for energy that they weren't making. And the infrastructure in that region was so bad that they were using helicopters to fly in food supply to the workers on the dam. That's how cut off things are, right? That flying, it was actually an easier way to transport something. When that's the situation you're dealing with, it's pretty easy to see how a government like that can collapse. And that's one of the questions that we're trying to think about throughout the series, is not just, that look at all this stuff that failed, but, it collapsed. And I think it was, at the time, I don't think it was particularly shocking that the Afghan government collapsed, but I think it left a lot of people in the West, in America, in Europe, sort of questioning what they had been doing there for 20 years.
Yeah.
Most of our lifetimes. It all seemed so pointless. Moving on from there, kind of a sad place to end, but I'm afraid that's going to be the nature of the show. Well, thank you guys for joining me today. We've got some other episodes planned. We've already planned on the ethnic makeup of Japan and domestic cultural practices that are important to understand.
Of Japan.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm going to say that again. The ethnic makeup of Afghanistan and some of the cultural practices there that are important to understand when talking about the Taliban and the violence in Afghanistan and the weakness of the government there. So, and Armand and Owen will be joining me for those.
We sure will.
So thank you guys.
All right, thank you.
Before you go, we want to say thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to check back soon for more. If you have any feedback for us, you can send us an email at unendinghistorypodcast@gmail.com.